Hi again, it's Jason from Fraser Valley Rose Farm. I've done a couple of videos now on Bokashi, but I still get frequent questions about the technique and its benefits, so there seems to be some confusion out there. I want to answer some of those questions today. I even saw an article written recently that was aimed at debunking Bokashi, which I thought was a curious choice. I mean, do you need to debunk worm composting or trench composting or hugelkultur? Not really. They're just different techniques for approaching the same kind of problem, each with their own advantages and disadvantages. So let's get right into it. The short answer is that Bokashi is an alternate way of dealing with organic waste from your kitchen scraps. So what you would do in this case is you place them into a bucket, you'd mash them down a little bit, you'd place some inoculant on top just to get the process started. When you have that bucket full and you let it rest for 2 or 3 weeks, it gets nice and fermented inside of there. You take it out to the garden, you dig it into a hole in the ground, the soil organisms do the rest, and so it's a great way of adding organic matter to your garden with as little fuss and muss as possible, none of the complexities of dealing with a hot compost system. Well, that depends on what you mean by composting. Most people, when they imagine composting, think of a compost pile in the yard where they'll add their kitchen waste and yard waste and all the organic waste from their property, and then over time, aerobic bacteria will break that down along with other organisms, and the final result of that composting is that if you dig into that pile, you will pull out something that is dark brown and warm and moist and looks great for spreading on top of the garden. Bokashi is different in that what you're doing is a fermenting pre-treatment inside, and when you're done that step, you aren't ending up with finished compost. You have to put it out into the yard for an additional step in the soil where it breaks down. So the process is very different. One uses aerobic bacteria, the other one uses anaerobic bacteria, but the outcome is very similar. Well, you don't really have to choose between them. I still use a compost pile in my yard for my yard and greenhouse wastes, but for kitchen scraps, I prefer Bokashi. The reason I like it better is there are fewer exclusions. I don't have to leave out meat or bones or pasta or oranges or anything else that are commonly asked to be excluded from a hot composting system. Also, it's less complicated. I don't have to worry about a carbon and nitrogen ratio. I don't have to worry about layering. I don't have to worry about turning the compost. And in a temperate climate like mine, where you do get a kind of a colder winter, sometimes managing a hot compost outdoors can be a little bit more difficult. With a Bokashi system, I can just add a few more buckets to my system and manage it in the garage until the season turns. You sure can, but you don't have to. The bucket system is a very, very easy setup, and I'll show you in this other video, which I'll link up above here, how you can set it up for yourself with not a lot of money. Now, what you may have to have on hand is Bokashi flakes, usually a wheat bran inoculated with the microorganisms to get the process started. No, I'm not in the business of making or selling Bokashi bran. I do make it for myself, for my own personal use, and I made a video to show you how you can do that as well. Commercially available bran usually has 3 types of organisms in it. It has lactobacillus, it has yeast, and it has a photosynthetic bacteria in there as well. What I found in making my own, that it's sufficient to just use the lactobacillus to get the process started. So that's what I do. If you would prefer to use, for convenience, the commercially prepared bran, there's plenty of sources for those. I will link one in my Amazon store just so you have an example of what to look for. Well, I don't see any reason why not, and in fact, if you do any kind of natural fermentation, like on sauerkraut or kimchi or pickles, on veggies, that involves lactobacillus, that's fine too. Any way that you have a live culture of lactobacillus, that's a great way to start your Bokashi. The bran flakes are just something that makes it convenient for you to store inert Bokashi flakes so that you can use them all year round and don't have to keep a live culture on hand. Well, sure. The Bran is just a stable, inert carrier for the lactobacillus, so it doesn't matter what it is, so long as it stays stable when stored, and stored dry preferably. You'll find that it lasts about a year to be effective for activating your bokashi, although maybe a little bit longer than that would be fine too if you kept it in a cool, dry, dark place. Okay, think of pickled cucumbers. To me, they just look like darkened, softened cucumbers. Or sauerkraut, shredded mushy cabbage. The process is not intended to break down the food. All it's supposed to do is acidify it and make it ready to break down once the soil bacteria gets a hold of it. So if you've done it right, what you should see is it may be a little softer in texture, and it probably smells acidic like a pickle. Well, good question, and some people do. They call it trench composting, and there's nothing wrong with that. There's a couple of reasons why I prefer bokashi over trench composting, one of which is that it's convenience. I don't want to have to go out after dinner every night to dig a bit of a trench and put out my food scraps. So it makes sense for me, time management wise, to batch it. And if I'm going to batch it, I'm probably going to have to store it for a while in the home until I have a large enough batch to make sense going out to the yard to do that. If I'm going to store it, then it kind of makes sense. The bokashi system is a great way to do that because you'll have a whole bucket full of it. It's a tight, closed system, so the flies and other pests won't find it and make a mess of it first, and you've already got the startings of the lactobacillus in there to make sure that it starts to break down and rot in the right way and doesn't get stinky or gross before you do that step. The second reason I like it is because I don't like to have, when I put it into my compost, I end up with rodent problems. Now, I can't say that bokashi is entirely without rodent problems, but I've known from experience that where I've placed my food scraps out in the hot compost system continually, ongoing, week after week, you end up with kind of a population of mice or rats that go there and sort of make their living around that compost. Whereas bokashi, if you're batching it and you're only going out there once a month, you find a corner of the property where you bury it and cover it, only the very largest of the pests, and in this case I'm talking about skunks, or on one occasion a neighborhood dog with a sharp nose got into it, but it breaks down relatively quickly after that, and it doesn't become a place for the rodents and pests to make their living. Okay, if you're using a 2-bucket system, the extra moisture from the top bucket will drain down into the lower bucket. Sometimes you have a spigot on that so you can drain that juice out from the system. That juice is a waste product of the process, and you can just pour it off in the garden. Now, I've never noticed any particular advantage to the plants nearby when I poured that out in the garden. It doesn't seem to help anything particularly much. That said, it's not harmful either. Now, some people have asked the question of whether they can use that juice to inoculate the next batch of the bokashi. Here's the thing, that juice is quite variable. Sometimes there's a lot of it, sometimes there's a little of it. It very much depends on how moist the initial food scraps are. It also is very inconsistent in its constituents. You really don't know what's in there in terms of bacteria, so at that point you'd be better off starting with a known bacterial culture than leaving it to chance as to what poured out through the bottom of that pot. Okay, so this is a related topic, but it's not really to do with the bokashi bucket system itself. There's something called effective microorganisms. Remember I mentioned earlier that the commercially available bokashi starter is lactobacillus, yeast, and photosynthetic bacteria. There's a specific mixture of those bacteria that have been put together and called effective microorganisms. The theory posed by a Japanese researcher, Dr. Higa, was that if you cultured these microorganisms in a large amount and you could put it into the field with your food crops or with your agricultural crops, and they would add a benefit to those agricultural crops. Problem is that that research has come into problems with replicatability, so we're really not that sure whether it works. So far as the bokashi system is involved, because it started out using that EM as its as its starter bacteria, then it has become associated with all of that research and it's become associated with that. But it really is quite a different system in its usage. So I just focus on the benefit of having an easy to use composting system for my organic waste, and I don't worry too much about whether it could have agricultural benefits. All right, that's it for my video today. I know that answered some of the more common questions I get about the Bokashi system, but if you have other questions that you think I might be able to answer, go ahead and drop those down below the video, and thank you so much for watching.